The Embassy Row mansions stood like silent sentinels along Massachusetts Avenue, their chandeliers casting golden squares onto snow-dusted sidewalks where diplomats in dark overcoats exchanged pleasantries that meant nothing and glances that meant everything. Washington in the 1950s wore two faces, the marble monuments gleaming with American idealism under winter sun, and the shadowed alleyways where briefcases changed hands and loyalty died quietly in the dark. Every cocktail party was a battlefield, every handshake a potential betrayal, and trust had become the rarest currency in a city drowning in secrets. The Cold War wasn't merely a geopolitical chess match fought in distant Korea or theoretical Berlin. It was here, breathing down the neck of every government clerk, every military attaché, every secretary who typed documents marked with crimson stamps that screamed their terrible importance. Inside the marble halls of power, men spoke in hushed tones about the invisible enemy, the communist spectre that supposedly lurked behind every door, justifying midnight interrogations and careers destroyed by whispered suspicions. Senator McCarthy's witch hunts had transformed colleagues into informants and neighbors into adversaries, creating a climate where paranoia flourished like black mold in damp corners. The loyalty oath became gospel, the polygraph machine a confessional booth for the new American religion of security clearances and background checks. Children practiced duck and cover drills beneath wooden desks as if childhood innocence could be preserved through rehearsed atomic survival, while their parents stockpiled canned goods and wondered which of their friends might be feeding secrets to Moscow. Yet beneath this theater of public hysteria, a real war raged in absolute silence, fought by men and women whose names would never grace newspapers, whose victories remained classified decades after their deaths. Dead drops in Rock Creek Park, microdots hidden in hollow coins, coded messages transmitted through seemingly innocent personal advertisements. This was the true front line where democracy and totalitarianism clashed without armies or declarations. The Soviets had perfected the art of infiltration, turning American idealists into unwitting traitors, exploiting every crack in the Republic's armor with patient, methodical precision. On a February morning when frost painted brutal flowers across government windows, an analyst's trembling hands delivered a folder that would shatter the Capitol's fragile sense of security and prove that sometimes the paranoia wasn't paranoid enough. The folder landed on Deputy Director Harrison's desk with the soft thud of catastrophe, its manila surface innocuous as a school report. Yet inside it carried the architectural blueprint of American humiliation. The analyst who delivered it, a pale young man named Whitmore, whose wire-rimmed spectacles, magnified eyes wide with professional terror, stood rigid as Harrison's weathered fingers opened the cover and began absorbing words that would steal his sleep for months. Intercepted cables from the National Security Agency had confirmed the unthinkable. Classified military assessments regarding Western European defense capabilities, atomic research progress reports from Los Alamos, and strategic position papers on potential Soviet aggression had all surfaced in Moscow Center within days of their creation. The leak wasn't a trickle but a hemorrhage, suggesting not some low-level clerk pilfering scraps, but a sophisticated network with access to the government's most protected chambers. Harrison's jaw tightened as he read, his knuckles whitening against the paper, understanding immediately that this revelation would transform the Capitol into a house of mirrors where every reflection might conceal a traitor. Within an hour, the seventh-floor conference room filled with grim-faced men whose collective authority could topple governments, yet who now confronted their own institutional blindness with barely suppressed rage. Cigarette smoke created grey clouds beneath fluorescent lights as operations chiefs reviewed the damage assessment, each stolen document representing another failure of the elaborate security apparatus they'd constructed with such confidence. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone with extraordinary access had been systematically photographing materials across multiple departments, suggesting either a mole positioned at the highest levels or a coordinated ring that had penetrated the bureaucracy like roots through cracked concrete. The counterintelligence chief, a granite-faced veteran named Donovan who'd hunted Nazis through post-war Europe, traced connection lines on a chalkboard with movements sharp as accusations. Every stolen document had passed through specific channels, been seen by particular eyes, touched by hands that might belong to Americans who'd sworn oaths they never intended to keep. The investigation parameters emerged through tense debate, absolute secrecy, minimal personnel, and the understanding that whoever they sought possessed training sophisticated enough to evade standard surveillance techniques employed against ordinary criminals. The Soviets had refined espionage into dark science, recruiting through ideological seduction rather than crude bribery, creating believers who spied not for money, but conviction, making them infinitely more dangerous than mercenaries. These weren't the bumbling communist sympathizers of propaganda films, but disciplined intelligence officers who understood tradecraft, counter-surveillance, and the patient art of deception that could sustain double lives for decades. The assembled men recognized they faced an adversary schooled in methodologies perfected through Stalinist purges and wartime necessity, an enemy who viewed espionage as existential warfare where capture meant neither trial nor imprisonment, but something far worse. Harrison closed the meeting with words that hung in the smoke-thick air like a death sentence. Finding this network wasn't merely professional necessity, but national survival, because if Moscow possessed such unfettered access to American secrets, the next war might be lost before the first bomb ever fell. The conference room door opened 12 hours after Harrison's grim pronouncement, admitting not one of the anticipated senior field officers with their decorated war records and Georgetown connections, but Catherine Hale, whose entrance carried the sharp click of sensible heels against linoleum and the weight of a career spent proving herself in rooms that never expected her arrival. She stood barely 5 feet 6 inches, her dark hair pulled into a practical twist that suggested efficiency over vanity, wearing a grey suit that matched the cigarette smoke still lingering from the previous meeting, like ghost testimony of masculine deliberation. The 3 remaining deputy directors exchanged glances that communicated volumes without words, their expressions cycling through surprise, confusion, and the particular brand of condescension reserved for women who'd infiltrated professional territories traditionally defended by testosterone and tradition. Harrison's introduction carried defensive undertones as he explained her unconventional background. Recruited from academic circles during wartime intelligence expansion, trained in counterintelligence methodologies at a facility most couldn't name, possessed of analytical capabilities that had quietly unraveled 2 smaller espionage operations the previous year without fanfare or recognition. Donovan leaned back in his chair with the skepticism of a man who'd seen empires fall, yet couldn't fathom female competence beyond secretarial efficiency, his question emerging wrapped in false courtesy that barely concealed genuine doubt about whether someone lacking operational field experience could possibly comprehend the Byzantine complexity of Soviet intelligence architecture. Catherine met his gaze with eyes the color of winter Atlantic waters, responding in measured tones that carried neither apology nor aggression, detailing her thesis work on Soviet recruitment psychology, her fluency in Russian, acquired through émigré tutors, her understanding of NKVD methodologies gleaned from defector debriefings she'd conducted, while male colleagues dismissed such interviews as mere paperwork. She referenced specific cases with casual precision, demonstrating knowledge of tradecraft particulars that transformed abstract theory into actionable intelligence, speaking the language of dead drops and brush passes with the fluency of someone who'd studied espionage as both science and art. The resistance in the room remained palpable despite her credentials, manifesting in crossed arms and exchanged smirks that questioned whether pursuing America's most sophisticated adversary required not just intelligence, but physical courage they assumed she lacked, the willingness to operate in shadows where mistakes meant consequences far beyond career setbacks. Harrison's voice cut through the doubt with administrative finality, explaining that conventional approaches had failed, that perhaps unconventionality itself was the weapon needed against an enemy expecting traditional responses from traditional operators. Catherine absorbed their skepticism like body armor absorbs bullets, understanding that proving herself wouldn't happen in conference rooms through credentials and logic, but in the field where results spoke louder than prejudice. She accepted the assignment folder with steady hands, already knowing that success would be credited to institutional wisdom, while failure would confirm every assumption about women exceeding their natural limitations. Yet she took it anyway, because the alternative was watching lesser minds fumble while traitors continued bleeding the nation dry. Catherine's first 72 hours inside the investigation revealed an organization operating with surgical precision that mirrored Soviet intelligence doctrine down to its methodological DNA. A phantom network that recruited through patience rather than coercion, targeting vulnerabilities with the clinical detachment of physicians diagnosing terminal illness. The documents spread across her borrowed desk in the basement office they'd allocated her told stories of systematic compromise, beginning not with dramatic approaches in dark alleys, but with casual conversations at faculty clubs, sympathetic listeners at union halls, ideological seduction disguised as intellectual discourse about economic justice and international peace. She traced recruitment patterns through coffee-stained surveillance reports and decoded cable traffic, recognizing the psychological architecture of handlers who understood that Americans betrayed their country not primarily for money, but for validation, belonging, the intoxicating belief they served higher purposes than narrow nationalism. The mastermind remained invisible behind operational security that suggested professional training exceeding typical diplomatic cover officers. Someone who never made direct contact yet orchestrated the network through cutouts and dead drops with the precise timing of a conductor leading an orchestra through complex symphony movements without ever touching an instrument. Catherine built her profile methodically, constructing personality from tradecraft choices the way archaeologists reconstruct civilizations from pottery fragments, understanding that whoever ran this operation possessed not just intelligence, but dangerous charisma, the ability to inspire loyalty that survived interrogation and imprisonment. The pattern suggested someone moving freely through Washington's diplomatic ecosystem, attending embassy receptions where champagne flowed and ideological enemies traded pleasantries beneath crystal chandeliers, using social access as operational camouflage while coordinating espionage that threatened strategic secrets from atomic research to military communications. Her analysis pointed toward the Soviet diplomatic community, but also revealed something more troubling, indicators suggesting the mastermind might be operating from positions even more protected than embassy immunity, someone whose American connections provided cover that traditional counterintelligence couldn't easily penetrate, without triggering diplomatic incidents or exposing surveillance capabilities. Catherine annotated files with observations her male predecessors had dismissed as irrelevant, connecting social relationships to intelligence compromises, recognizing that in this invisible war, the most dangerous weapons weren't guns, but charm and conviction wielded by true believers who considered betrayal a form of enlightenment. She understood with cold clarity that catching this particular ghost would require becoming something her training manuals never discussed, transforming herself from analyst into actor, capable of moving through the same refined circles where treason wore evening gowns and tuxedos. where one wrong word or gesture could mean not just professional failure, but something far more permanent. The game was entering its next phase, and she had just bought her ticket to a world where every handshake carried hidden meaning and every smile concealed calculation. Catherine's surveillance operation began in the grey pre-dawn hours when Washington's streets belonged to newspaper deliveries and milk trucks. Her unmarked sedan, positioned 3 blocks from the Soviet embassy, where diplomatic vehicles emerged like clockwork for morning routines that concealed operational movements within bureaucratic predictability. She'd requisitioned 2 junior analysts who treated her authority with barely disguised contempt, their report submissions arriving late and incomplete, summaries that missed crucial details she'd specifically requested about travel patterns and unexplained absences from official functions. The institutional resistance manifested in missing surveillance logs, equipment mysteriously reassigned to other operations, meeting requests that disappeared into administrative black holes, where her male colleagues' priorities somehow always superseded hers, despite direct orders from Patterson's office that everyone conveniently misinterpreted or selectively forgot. The dead drop locations she'd identified from pattern analysis required constant monitoring. Tedious hours watching park benches and hollow trees in diplomatic neighborhoods where her presence risked exposure if she maintained surveillance too obviously or too long. She developed cover routines that transformed her into invisible fixtures of upper northwest Washington's landscape. The young mother pushing an empty pram through Montrose Park, the secretary eating lunch alone with paperback novels in Dumbarton Oaks, personas that allowed observation without generating the particular attention that solitary women attracted in spaces designed for families and couples. Each location revealed fragments of operational rhythm, chalk marks appearing on mailboxes that signaled communication needs, newspapers left folded in specific configurations that indicated successful intelligence transfers, tradecraft borrowed directly from Moscow Center's playbook, yet adapted with improvisations suggesting American familiarity with local customs and surveillance blind spots. Her requests for additional personnel disappeared into bureaucratic machinery, where section chiefs questioned whether resources should be wasted on theories developed by someone whose primary qualification seemed to be Patterson's inexplicable faith rather than field experience that earned respect. Catherine documented everything in duplicate, keeping personal copies in her apartment safe because files had ways of vanishing from official records when conclusions contradicted preferred narratives or threatened comfortable assumptions. The isolation sharpened her focus, transformed obstacles into motivation, each dismissive comment from colleagues fueling determination that burned colder and more dangerous than anger. She understood that breaking this case meant working twice as hard for half the credit, that her eventual success would be attributed to luck rather than skill, that failure would confirm every prejudice about women lacking the temperament for counterintelligence's psychological brutality. But understanding didn't mean accepting, and she'd learned long ago that the system changed not through permission, but through results that made denial impossible. Catherine's breakthrough arrived through studying absence rather than presence, noticing which diplomatic functions experienced inexplicable cancellations when certain cultural attachés claimed illness, which embassy receptions concluded early when specific trade representatives departed citing emergencies that left no paper trail in official channels. The pattern suggested coordination disguised as coincidence, a shadow schedule operating beneath Washington's diplomatic calendar, where genuine détente gestures provided cover for intelligence exchanges between handlers and assets who moved through cocktail parties like fish through welcoming water. She requisitioned invitations to upcoming events through State Department contacts who owed her mentor favors, transforming herself from surveillance operator into participant, a role requiring wardrobe investments, her government salary barely accommodated, and social polish that felt like wearing Someone else's skin over her analytical instincts. The French ambassador's reception at Anderson House offered her entry into circles where diplomatic immunity created neutral ground, where Soviet attachés and American officials maintained carefully choreographed civility, while their intelligence services waged invisible war beneath champagne. Toasts and cultural exchange pleasantries. Catherine arrived in a borrowed evening gown that whispered against marble floors, her operational awareness cataloguing exits and sightlines while projecting the relaxed confidence of someone who belonged among oil paintings and Renaissance tapestries. She positioned herself near the salon's periphery, where conversational groups formed and dissolved like temporary alliances, watching a particular cultural affairs officer whose travel patterns matched dead-drop activation schedules with suspicious precision. His movements through the reception following routes that maximized contact opportunities while maintaining plausible deniability. The Soviet moved with practiced ease through clusters of diplomats and Georgetown socialites, his English carrying Oxford Polish that obscured Leningrad origins, charm deployed like precision instruments that disarmed suspicion while gathering conversational intelligence about policy debates and personnel changes. Catherine intercepted his trajectory near the champagne fountain, manufacturing an accidental collision that spilled nothing but created opening for apologetic introduction, her cover identity as Commerce Department economic analyst, providing legitimate reason for attendance and natural conversation topics about trade negotiations. His eyes assessed her with professional thoroughness, disguised as social interest, calculating whether she represented opportunity or threat, his smile never quite reaching the calculating intelligence that evaluated her responses for useful information or dangerous awareness. Their conversation danced around substance while trading meaningless pleasantries about cultural programming and diplomatic reception fatigue, each word carrying potential meaning beyond surface content, Catherine probing gently for reactions, while he deflected with anecdotes that revealed nothing except sophisticated training. She understood the game's stakes, that missteps meant exposure, while success meant proximity to networks she'd tracked for months. Her pulse, steady despite knowing she'd just stepped onto operational ground where mistakes became career-ending disasters or worse. Their next encounter occurred 3 days later at the Phillips Collection during a Soviet cultural exhibition, where abstract paintings provided cover for proximity that appeared coincidental rather than orchestrated. Catherine studied a Kandinsky while monitoring reflections in the gallery glass. Watching Volkov, she'd learned his name through diplomatic registry cross-reference. Pause before a Rothko with appreciation that seemed genuine beneath operational purpose. He acknowledged her presence with the bemused recognition of social acquaintances rediscovering each other. In unexpected contexts, his approach casual enough to deflect watchers while purposeful enough to confirm mutual interest. Their conversation about artistic interpretation carried subtext about perception and hidden meanings, words chosen for double significance that acknowledged the game without naming it, each casual observation testing whether the other recognized the careful dance they'd begun at Anderson House. Catherine felt the surveillance before identifying its source. That peculiar awareness developed through months of operational work, when attention becomes almost tangible against your spine. A woman examining sculpture near the gallery entrance maintained too perfect disinterest in their conversation, her positioning optimized for observation rather than artistic appreciation, confirmation that Volkov's network had activated protective measures around their potentially compromised asset. The realization sent calculated adrenaline through Catherine's system, understanding that her infiltration had triggered counterintelligence protocols designed to identify threats before they matured into operational disasters. She adjusted her behavior toward genuine art enthusiasm rather than intelligence gathering, manufacturing reasons to drift away from Volkov while maintaining enough interest to seem natural, playing the role of potential recruitment target rather than investigating officer. The following week brought evidence that the spy ring had shifted to defensive operations, dead drops remaining inactive while surveillance detected counter-surveillance teams photographing her apartment building and following her morning routes to headquarters. Catherine's superiors advocated pulling back before exposure compromised broader counterintelligence operations, their caution reflecting institutional preference for protecting existing advantages over pursuing uncertain victories. She argued for continued engagement despite elevated risk, recognizing that the network's defensive posture revealed vulnerability beneath its sophisticated tradecraft, that Volkov's handlers feared discovery enough to deploy resources that might themselves provide investigative leads through careful observation. The chess match had entered its critical middle game, where each move carried consequence, where Catherine's proximity to the truth made her simultaneously valuable and expendable in calculations that reduced human lives to operational mathematics. She understood the knife edge. She walked between breakthrough and disaster, feeling the invisible walls closing around her, while the mastermind she hunted adjusted tactics in response to pressure only partially visible from inside the trap. Washington's spring beauty seemed almost mocking against the shadow war's intensification, cherry blossoms blooming oblivious to the deadly serious game playing out beneath their delicate petals. The abandoned safe house in Georgetown smelled of old radiator heat and stale cigarette smoke, its windows overlooking the Potomac obscured by curtains, yellowed with decades of nicotine and neglect. Catherine arrived 40 minutes early, checking sightlines and escape routes with tradecraft precision, while her heart hammered against her ribs in rhythms that threatened to betray the calm exterior she'd cultivated through months of operational discipline. The meet had been arranged through coded newspaper advertisements, a desperate gambit suggesting Volkov wanted to talk without his handler's knowledge, though whether genuine desperation or sophisticated trap remained dangerously unclear until words were spoken and intentions revealed through micro-expressions no amount of KGB training could completely suppress. She positioned herself with back to the corner, sight lines clear to both entrance and fire escape, her hand resting casually near the purse containing her service revolver, though she knew shooting her way out represented operational failure rather than viable extraction strategy. The waiting stretched like wire pulled taut, each creak of settling floorboards triggering adrenaline spikes she forced down through. Controlled breathing, aware that appearing desperate would shift psychological advantage toward whoever walked through that door. Spring rain began pattering against grimy windows, the sound oddly comforting in its normalcy, nature indifferent to the human dramas of loyalty and betrayal playing out beneath its steady rhythm. Volkov entered, precisely on time, his careful movements suggesting similar caution about potential ambush, his eyes finding hers with recognition that carried exhaustion beneath its professional wariness. He looked older somehow, the charismatic diplomat's mask slipping to reveal the operational officer beneath, a man caught between competing loyalties in machinery that ground individuals into operational necessity without mercy or sentiment. Catherine waited for him to speak first, using silence as weapon and psychological pressure. Watching him choose words with the care of someone navigating conversational minefields where single syllables might detonate careers or compromise networks spanning continents. The air between them crackled with unspoken accusations and desperate calculations, two intelligence officers recognizing each other's humanity while representing systems that demanded its sacrifice. Rain intensified against windows, providing acoustic cover for conversation while seeming to isolate them from the city beyond, creating temporary pocket universe where only their choices and words held consequence. Catherine saw his resolve wavering, that precise moment when ideology confronts practical reality and men discover whether their convictions survive contact with genuine moral complexity rather than theoretical abstractions debated in secure Moscow conference rooms. His confession emerged not as dramatic revelation, but quiet admission of disillusionment. Words describing recruitment during university idealism that had curdled into recognition of serving apparatus as morally compromised as the system it opposed. Catherine listened without interruption, recognizing manipulation potential while sensing authentic desperation beneath practiced tradecraft. Understanding that defection offers often emerged from exhaustion rather than dramatic conversion experiences beloved by Hollywood and recruitment manuals. She made her counteroffer carefully, promising protection and new identity in exchange for complete network exposure, naming names and methodologies with specificity that would dismantle the apparatus he'd helped construct over years of patient intelligence gathering. The silence following her proposition stretched uncomfortably as Volkov calculated odds and consequences, weighing betrayal against survival, while Catherine maintained expression of professional detachment, masking desperate hope that this gambit wouldn't end with bullets or diplomatic immunity protecting murderers. His slow nod carried weight of empires shifting, small human choice that would echo through intelligence communities and alter the Cold War's careful balance in ways neither could fully predict from inside that shabby room where rain continued falling with absolute indifference. The package he produced contained everything: names, dead drop locations, communication schedules, and most critically, confirmation that the Mastermind operated from within State Department translation services with access that made previous security assumptions catastrophically naive. Catherine photographed each document with miniature camera while monitoring windows and door, aware that every second increased exposure risk, as handlers might have followed Volkov despite precautions. That extraction window was closing with each shutter click. She outlined exfiltration protocol quickly, safe houses and recognition signals memorized rather than written, understanding that operational security now protected both their lives against apparatus that eliminated loose ends with industrial efficiency. Volkov's hands trembled slightly as he pocketed instructions, the physical manifestation of fear that ideology could no longer suppress, recognition that he'd crossed threshold from which no return existed regardless of second thoughts or nostalgic loyalty. Their parting carried no drama, just professional acknowledgement between operatives who'd chosen different sides of history's temporary divide. Brief nod containing respect that transcended political allegiance. Catherine waited 20 minutes after his departure before leaving separately, emerging into rain-washed streets where cherry blossoms scattered like pink snow. Beauty and danger intermingled in the city that held secrets enough to topple governments. The operational order came down at dawn, transmitted through secure channels with the terse efficiency that characterized agency communications when diplomatic catastrophe hung in balance. Catherine coordinated simultaneously with FBI counterintelligence teams positioned around State Department perimeters while monitoring diplomatic cable traffic for any hint that Soviet embassy had detected the closing net. The arrest protocol demanded surgical precision, capturing operatives before destruction of evidence while avoiding international incident that might explode into front-page scandal, derailing arms negotiations that hung by threads spun from mutual suspicion and fragile trust. Her hands moved across city maps, marking ingress points and fallback positions, choreographing a raid that would unfold across Washington with split-second timing, aware that single miscalculation might let the network scatter like startled crows. Director Dulles himself monitored from headquarters, his presence adding pressure Catherine felt like physical weight. Though she'd earned operational autonomy through months of meticulous investigation that now culminated in this irreversible moment. Outside her window, the capital awakened to ordinary Friday routines, citizens oblivious to the silent war being waged between monuments and government buildings where loyalty remained perpetually questioned. The raids commenced at precisely 800 hours, coordinated teams moving on 6 locations simultaneously while Catherine led the primary assault on the translation office, where months of investigation converged. She entered behind FBI agents with warrants that meant nothing if targets invoked diplomatic immunity, racing against telephone calls that could summon lawyers and Soviet handlers before evidence could be secured. The Mastermind, a middle-aged woman named Helen Morrison, whose quiet competence had rendered her invisible among ambitious male colleagues, sat frozen at her desk as agents flooded the office. Catherine saw recognition flare in Morrison's eyes, that instant of understanding that her careful construction had finally collapsed, followed by desperate calculation about escape routes already sealed. The arrest unfolded with surprising, quiet, no dramatic confrontations or Hollywood heroics, just professional restraint as Morrison's hands were cuffed and rights recited in monotone that seemed absurdly bureaucratic for a moment of such consequence. Catherine secured the desk drawers personally, finding cipher pads and microfilm concealed in hollowed reference books, physical proof that would survive any legal challenges or diplomatic protests Moscow might manufacture. The Soviet embassy erupted within the hour, attachés demanding access to arrested personnel while invoking Vienna conventions and threatening reciprocal harassment of American diplomats stationed in Moscow. Catherine watched from operations center as diplomatic chess played out, knowing that captured evidence mattered more than individual prosecutions, that intelligence value exceeded any courtroom victory. 3 operatives attempted escape through prearranged protocols, only to find extraction routes already blocked by agents positioned through Catherine's predictive analysis of network behavior patterns. She monitored radio traffic as suspects were transported to separate facilities, isolation, preventing coordination of cover stories, creating pressure for confession that psychological interrogators would exploit through coming hours. The magnitude of what they'd captured became clear through debriefing reports, a network that had compromised weapons specifications, diplomatic strategies, and counterintelligence operations over nearly 5 years of patient exploitation. Morrison herself remained silent through initial questioning, professional tradecraft holding against pressure, though Catherine knew that evidence weight would eventually crack resolve or render cooperation unnecessary. By nightfall, Washington's intelligence community processed shockwaves that would reverberate through security protocols for decades, forcing recognition that Soviet penetration had achieved sophistication exceeding worst paranoid projections. Catherine stood in rain outside Justice Department headquarters, watching as Morrison was transferred under heavy guard. 2 women on opposite sides of history's divide, their brief eye contact carrying acknowledgement without understanding. The captured documents would occupy analysts for months, exposing methods and compromises that demanded complete security architecture overhaul, painful recognition of vulnerability. The Cold War's invisible battles demanded constant vigilance. She felt exhaustion settling into bones, the accumulated weight of months spent navigating bureaucratic obstacles and operational dangers, triumph mixed with recognition of personal costs and relationships, sacrificed to professional obsession. The cherry blossoms had finished blooming, their brief beauty replaced by practical green leaves as Washington transitioned towards summer heat. The capital's cycle, continuing regardless of human dramas, played out beneath its monuments. The congressional hearings began in autumn, closed-door sessions where Catherine testified before committees desperate to understand how Soviet intelligence had penetrated so deeply into American infrastructure. She sat beneath harsh fluorescent lights in windowless rooms, recounting her investigation with clinical precision, while senators and representatives struggled between gratitude for her success and discomfort with operational realities she represented. The classified nature of proceedings meant her achievement would never receive public recognition. No newspaper headlines celebrating the woman who dismantled the most sophisticated espionage network of the decade. Instead, she returned to Langley corridors, where male colleagues offered grudging respect mixed with resentment, her success simultaneously validating and threatening the institutional order that had doubted her capabilities. Director Dulles commended her privately, though promotion remained complicated by agency politics that couldn't quite reconcile groundbreaking performance with gender assumptions embedded in Cold War intelligence culture. She requested reassignment to Soviet Analysis Division, preferring research depth over operational fieldwork that had extracted costs she was still calculating in sleepless nights and fractured personal relationships. The medal they awarded her remained locked in classified vault, recognition that existed only in secret files and whispered conversations among those cleared to know what really happened. Morrison's trial proceeded through winter months, prosecution carefully managing classified evidence while defense attorneys challenged surveillance methods and constitutional protections strained by national security imperatives. Catherine watched from gallery during unclassified portions, studying the woman who'd become her mirror opposite, wondering what conviction or desperation had driven such sustained betrayal. The testimony revealed Morrison's recruitment during wartime service in Moscow, ideological conversion mixing with personal grievances against system that had undervalued her contributions while promoting less capable men. 3 network members accepted plea agreements, cooperating with counterintelligence debriefers who mapped Soviet intelligence architecture through their confessions, trading reduced sentences for information that strengthened American defenses. Morrison herself received 20 years, sentence delivered in courtroom ceremony that seemed inadequate for damage inflicted, yet excessive for women whose quiet incompetence had simply served different masters. Catherine felt no satisfaction in victory, only recognition of Cold War's grinding machinery that consumed operatives on both sides with equal indifference. The case files were sealed for 50 years, buried in archives where future historians might eventually discover the invisible war waged between women the 1950s barely acknowledged existed. Spring returned to Washington with cherry blossoms blooming again, their transient beauty reminding Catherine of impermanence underlying Cold War certainties that seemed absolute yet shifted constantly. She'd earned respect within agency walls, but remained singular exception rather than herald of systemic change, woman whose achievement was simultaneously celebrated and contained by institutional frameworks resistant to transformation. The intelligence flowing from captured Soviet documents continued revealing penetrations and compromises, justifying paranoia that characterized the era while demonstrating vulnerability beneath American confidence. Catherine compiled lessons learned into training protocols, teaching new counterintelligence officers about pattern recognition and surveillance techniques that had proven decisive, her methodology becoming doctrine for a generation of spy catchers. She maintained contact with few civilians who understood her work's nature, the operational security requirements, creating isolation that no professional success could fully compensate. Occasionally she glimpsed Morrison's photograph in classified files, 2 women whose parallel dedication had placed them on collision course history would remember only in sanitized summaries. The legacy she forged remained largely invisible, footnotes in operational histories that wouldn't be declassified for decades. Yet her methods influenced counterintelligence tradecraft throughout Cold War's remaining decades. Catherine continued serving through Cuban Missile Crisis and Vietnam escalation, steady presence in agency corridors where her judgment commanded authority earned through operational success, no longer questioned or diminished. She trained female recruits who arrived in slowly increasing numbers, women who benefited from barriers she'd fractured through competence that demanded recognition despite systemic resistance. The Cold War ground onward through détente and renewed tensions, ideological conflict that consumed careers and lives in service to abstractions about freedom and security. When she finally retired, the agency awarded her Distinguished Intelligence Cross in private ceremony, attended by those cleared to know what she'd accomplished in dawn raids and diplomatic complications. Catherine kept the medal in desk drawer, symbol of recognition that mattered less than knowing she'd protected country and proven capabilities that gender should never have questioned. Legacy measured not in monuments, but in quiet competence that changed institution from within. What secrets from the Cold War era do you think still remain classified today? Subscribe to uncover more hidden stories from history's shadows.